The sun dipped low in a hazy, green-tinged sky, casting a sickly light over the silent ruins of what had once been a bustling city. Pavement cracked and buckled under vines that pulsed faintly, wrapping around skeletal streetlights like they were reclaiming lost territory. A lone figure strode down the empty street with precise, measured steps. Despite the decay around him, he was immaculate. His black tactical jacket hugged his frame, crisp and clean, as if he'd stepped straight out of a private security briefing instead of the end of the world. His shirt was buttoned to the collar, sleeves rolled to military precision. An old insignia on his shoulder, a faint emblem of his past life in private military work, was barely visible under the layer of dust. He scanned his surroundings, his gaze flicking up to the trees where squirrels huddled in eerie stillness. Their eyes glinted with a dark, intelligent focus, as if they were sizing him up, calculating. He kept moving, boots hitting the cracked pavement with a steady rhythm, his posture unyielding. At an overgrown street corner, he paused, pulling out a worn, dog-eared map. He traced a line along his route, adding a careful X with a black marker. It was a map of danger zones, safe paths, and territories where the mutated creatures lurked. He'd survived this long by treating each step like a mission. "Discipline keeps you alive," he muttered, voice low, almost reverent. A faint rustling nearby drew his attention, and his hand instinctively dropped to his belt where a combat knife hung, sharp and ready. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a figure, a man, or at least what looked like one, stumbling out from a nearby alley, his clothes torn, face pale. The man stopped, meeting his gaze with hollow, red-rimmed eyes. He looked human, but there was something wrong, something broken and hungry in his stare. "You alone?" questioned the military vet. The man nodded, his eyes darting to the trees as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. You haven't heard?" His voice was a dry whisper. "They've released it. The squirrels. They've poisoned the air," stated by the strange man. The sharp-dressed man's jaw tightened, though his face remained impassive. He'd heard rumors, fragments of the truth scattered like ash. The tree treaty, a failed attempt to broker peace. A betrayal. A chemical that had changed the very DNA of every living primate, twisting humanity into a shadow of itself. "I know," he replied. The stranger's gaze grew unfocused, and he stumbled closer, a strange gleam in his eye. "It's in the air. It's in us. Some of us changed. Others," he trailed off, the word unspoken but clear, "dead." A low growl sounded from the trees, and his hand tightened on his knife. In a flash, the stranger lurched forward, his mouth opening wider than it should, a gleam of bloodlust lighting his eyes. In a single fluid motion, the ex-professional gunman sidestepped, bringing the knife up with military precision. The blade sliced through the air, finding its mark, and the stranger crumpled to the ground in silence. He wiped the knife clean on his sleeve, his face unreadable. He'd seen worse. He'd done worse. Without a glance back, he marked another X on his map and continued down the road, each step a steady, rhythmic reminder of the discipline that had kept him alive. As he walked, his eyes scanned his surroundings, but his mind drifted back to life before the treaty, before everything had twisted into this nightmare. He remembered the sharp, orderly lines of barracks and briefing rooms, the low hum of machinery, and the simple satisfaction of knowing exactly where he stood in the world. Back then, his work had been clear-cut, protection contracts, high-stakes security, keeping high-value assets safe. There was a kind of honor in the structure, a reassurance that discipline could hold chaos at bay. "And we thought we knew chaos," he mused bitterly. "We didn't have a clue." He clenched his jaw as memories flickered like a slideshow of everything that had been lost. Humanity had come together once, in the wake of the environmental crisis, with an ambitious attempt to forge an alliance with nature. He recalled the promises, the optimism, the world's leaders smiling as they signed the Tree Treaty, a symbolic pact that would unite humans and the natural world in a bid for survival. But the squirrels, they'd been watching, waiting, and far sharper than anyone knew. Humanity had always underestimated them. Maybe it was the size, the twitching tails, or the small, quick movements that made them seem harmless. Now, those small eyes in the branches seemed to follow him with a precise, knowing gaze. He adjusted his grip on his knife, more to steady himself than anything. They were always there, skittering along branches just out of reach, slipping through the leaves like shadows. He'd felt their eyes on him for miles, silent observers charting his every step, every choice. How long have they been planning this? He wondered. How long have they waited, watching us build, destroy, and rebuild? Did they know we'd betray the treaty? A soft chittering echoed from above, and he glanced up, catching sight of a squirrel perched on a branch, its tail flicking in an odd, measured pattern. It was too focused, too deliberate, as if it were signaling to something else deeper in the trees. He quickened his pace, feeling their presence like 1,000 tiny eyes following him down the cracked and empty street. He'd seen it before. A band of survivors had tried to set up camp in an abandoned town not far from here. When he'd passed through, all that was left were claw marks in the dirt, tattered clothing, and a faint scent of decay. The squirrels had picked them off, one by one. He shook off the memory, forcing his thoughts back to survival. Discipline, routine, awareness. That's what keeps you alive. The mantra was as familiar to him as breathing, something he repeated when the world pressed in too close. But a part of him, buried deep under layers of training and habit, couldn't help but question how long discipline would hold out against nature turned ruthless, against creatures that had been watching his every move from the start. As he walked, the distant silhouette of the town came into view, dark against the green-gray sky. This place, rumor had it, was a cache of forgotten supplies. Ammunition, weapons, and maybe, if he was lucky, a safe place to rest for a few hours without feeling those watchful eyes. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crinkled map, worn soft from his constant adjustments and markings. Along the edges, various symbols marked known locations, circles for potential camps, triangles for traps, and slashes for areas crawling with it changed. This town, he'd marked with a square and a tiny bullet icon, his symbol for a possible weapons stash. But the map wasn't all hopeful markings. Near the bottom, at the edge of his journey's path, was a different symbol entirely. A black X, smudged and bold, its edges pressed down harder than any other mark on the page. He could feel his jaw tighten just looking at it. That was the place where he'd lost them, his team. We were trained for everything, he thought bitterly, eyes narrowing at the memory. Prepared for anything. Or so he thought. But when they entered that area, what was once a research facility, an outpost of bioengineers hoping to cure the virus, everything had gone sideways. He remembered the faint chemical haze, the sharp, metallic tang in the air that clung to his tongue. He forced himself back to the present, pushing the map back into his jacket. That black X haunted him. Even now, his muscles tightened just thinking about the look in their eyes, the fear, the disbelief. They had all been so highly trained, so sure of themselves, but in that moment, they'd been as helpless as anyone else. Not this time, he thought, steadying his breathing as he closed in on the town. He reached the first building on the town's outskirts, a decaying old gas station. Its windows were shattered, paint peeling in thick strips from the walls. He approached cautiously, fingers brushing over the grip of his Glock, his eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. He knew better than to assume he was alone. He slipped inside, checking each corner, every surface. His gaze lingered on the shelves, now empty except for a few rusted cans, but the counter was intact. Dust covered the surface, but beneath it, he saw faint scratches, marks left by something with claws, something that had dragged itself across the floor. Just as he was about to move further in, a creak echoed from the back room. He tensed, drawing his Glock and aiming it steadily at the door. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, the sharp instinct that had saved him more than once. Discipline, routine, awareness, he murmured under his breath. He took a step forward, ready for whatever might be lurking behind that door.